Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us once more. My name is Yaël Ossowski. I'm a national investigative reporter for Watchdog.org and the program director for European Students for Liberty, and I am quite honored to be with my next guest. Mr. Steven Greenhut was my former employer at the Franklin Center and Watchdog.org, where he was the vice president of journalism. He is today the California columnist for the Union Tribune over in San Diego, California, and his writings have appeared, and he's worked for grand publications. He's worked for the Lima News. He's worked as well for the Orange County Register, Better Homes and Garden, and we've seen many of his pieces on Reason.com and a host of websites all across the internet. But most famously, at least for this topic, he is the author of a book called Plunder: How Public Employee Unions Are Raiding Treasuries, Controlling Our Lives, and Bankrupting the Nation. And we've brought Mr. Greenhut on to talk about the pension crisis, how to understand it, how to break it down, and how we can finally decipher this, both for ourselves as journalists and for the regular public who are the ones getting screwed. So without a further ado, I'll give it away to Mr. Greenhut and ask him the simple question: what is the pension crisis?
Yeah, all in 15 minutes. We should. Yeah, the pension issue is becoming increasingly in the news, and is a lot of complexity to it. And there's some basics I think reporters need to understand to realize they're essentially cities and states have promised their public employee workers, thanks to the power of the unions that represent them, levels of pensions, retirement benefits that are unsustainable and are leading to tax increases, that are dramatically reducing public services in cities, leading to bankruptcy of some cities, and causing unfunded liabilities, which is a fancy way of saying debt. That's the future debt to pay all the promises made. And this is so. I think the first thing that a reporter needs to understand is how the public employee pension system works, and without do it so that your eyes aren't glazing over. But it's really crucial to understand. Now, most of us in the private sector get what are called defined contribution plans, like 401ks. There's a set defined, and all the terminology relating to pensions is designed to make your eyes glaze over, so you don't pay attention to the thievery going on. So don't let the terminology get you down. But defined contributions, there's a set amount of money contributed to my account. So at my employer, UT San Diego, formerly known as the San Diego Union Tribune, there's a percentage of money that's taken out of my paycheck, and then a certain percentage is matched, goes into an account, and if the stock market and the investments of the account, we choose a mutual fund or bonds or however we choose to a limited amount of choices on how that money's invested. So if the stock market goes up and the mutual fund made good investments, and I put more money in, by the time I retire, theoretically, I have a nest egg, and the employer knows how much money he's on the hook for because he is promised to match no more than X amount. And that's that. And if everything goes well, you have more money to retire with. And if all doesn't go well, you have less money to retire with. Oh, well, that's how life works. Public employee used to be in the private sector, and the big corporations, General Motors and those big type of corporate entities and the government sector would all have what's called defined benefits. That means that the benefit is defined, not the contribution. So the employer or the government doesn't know how much it's going to owe because they're promising a payout. They're not promising an amount that they put into my account. They're promising a benefit I get based on numbers of years worked and so on and so forth. Years worked and the formula. There's a formula that they have. So most of the big companies have had hard times, and they've gotten rid of those defined benefits and switched to a defined contribution because a lot of these companies were going belly up because of the debts. It just grew to a point where they couldn't. It was just eating into everything else. Private sector is able to do that. Public sector can't do that. The public sector, the unions, the members of the unions who get these grand benefits, and they are grand in California, a little less grand in other states, but still a lot better than your average Joe gets. The elected officials who vote on these plans are elected by the union members. In California, the most powerful political force is unquestionably the public sector labor unions. Variety of them, but they all want the same thing. And what is it unions ultimately want? A famous union official was asked, "What is it you ultimately want? What's your end game?" And one word answer: more. That's what they want, more. So in California, we have typically the formulas vary by jurisdiction. But in 1999, there was a bill passed, a state bill that increased the California Highway Patrol pension benefit to, they were given 3% at 50. You'll hear those numbers a lot. Again, your eyes glaze over, but it's really interesting. They were told it was just a 1% increase, go from sometimes you'll see from a 2% at 50 to a 3%. Actually, that's a 50% increase. So a little math is helpful here. But 3% means 3% of their final year's salary multiplied times the number of years work. So if I'm making 100,000 a year, and your typical CHP employee makes more than 100,000 a year, but let's just say 100,000 a year, 3% of that times the number of years work. So you get 90% of your final year's pay. So you get $90,000 at age 50, the 3% at age 50 for the rest of your life and your spouse's life. And in fact, a new actuarial term called the Viagra effect, because a lot of these public safety officers are retiring. So they're retiring at age 50, and they retire at 50 because if you work longer, you're essentially working for free. By the time you add all the pension spiking gimmicks, they're often earning more in retirement than they were receiving as an employee. But then they're marrying really young people, and the benefit extends to the spouse. And so the actuaries have to keep in mind how many years the taxpayer's on the hook, and the taxpayer is on the hook for this, come hell or high water. And so anyway, and that's the basic problem. So you see these numbers, these unfunded liabilities. It's the debt to pay for all this. But here's the thing that makes it really frustrating. It's based on a guess. Uh, the pension funds, which are entirely controlled by unions, like the California Public Employee Retirement System, which is a huge advocate for all this pension increasing, and for pension spiking, which are these really seedy gimmicks to inflate your final year's pay so that you can, for the rest of your life, enjoy a higher pension. And their employees get their pension, and their members get these pensions. Anyway, they invest. They take the money that is from an employee contribution, and the government agency, contributes a portion of the salaries. In the private sector, the benefit portion sometimes is like 18 to 30%. In the public sector, with the police and firefighters and public safety, which gets a higher number, and that includes billboard inspectors, milk inspectors, cooks. It's an ever-expanding category. Everyone wants to be public safety. Sometimes it's 60% of their pay. So these cities put in this money, and in public safety, usually the employee's contribution, I put in a portion, the agency puts in a portion. Well, my portion's picked up by the agency, so I don't put in anything in many cases. And so this money is taken, it's invested in stocks, bonds, real estate deals, whatever. And then the retirement system guesses at the rate of return. So if the stock market's doing really well and they're getting 10% rates of return, 8%, there's a lower predicted debt, a lower unfunded liability. When the stock market goes down, the size of the predicted debt goes way up, and then taxpayers have to contribute more. So what we've had is, they've been predicting really aggressive rates of return that, like 8%, 7.75, 7.5. It's been reduced in some of them. Rates of return that if you or I were told we would be guaranteed that kind of rate of return, we would take all our money and just put it there and not worry about it. So then they have to invest and be increasingly aggressive in their investments to meet those rates of return. So it's a great deal for public employees. It's the privatization of gain and the socialization of risk. That's not the right term. So essentially, if they score and the stock market does really well, the public employees get all the gain. Their unions say, "Hey, look, we're flush with cash. We deserve more money." And when it goes south, they say, "It's not my problem. It's the taxpayer's problem. Pony up, put in more money."
Yeah,
So
I think that speaks to the core of it. Is we have to always analyze and think from the point of view of the individual taxpayer. You as a taxpayer, you're taking money from your own paycheck and giving it to the state and federal government, and sometimes the city government every single paycheck. And more of that money is, in many of these cases, and that's what Stephen has been discovering, has been squandered. And I know that specifically in Florida, there are a lot of cases where the debt of the pensions got so bad that they had to take out extra bonds. There had to be votes. There had to be these kind of crisis managers and consultants brought in to figure out how they could get rid of this situation. So a question that I would like to ask you is, where can we look for reform, or how can we even introduce the idea of reform or try to cover it? Where is reform going to come from, and how can we cover that responsibly?
well, reform is a tough. I mean, that's a big tough thing. But let me make a couple points and I'll get to the reform. I mean, keep in mind these are things that a reporter needs to keep in mind. Money's fungible, right? So um, if there's a tax increase that a city has to pass to pay for public safety. That's what they typically do. They'll say, we'll have a public safety tax. Well, why do they need that tax? Because they've squandered all the money on pensions. So money's fungible. So every tax that a locality has now is essentially a pension tax. And the other thing to look at, and this is where a lot of progressives in California, a lot of people on the left are leading the charge for pension reform because everything else has to get cut. And in California, we have what's known as the California rule. It's basically a judicial decision that said that once a benefit level is promised to a public employee, a pension level on a vested benefit, it can never be cut, even going forward. So, starting tomorrow, you can't lower their amount. So the only thing you can do is lower the formula for new hires. Well, then this debt keeps getting bigger and bigger. So getting to reform. Some of the reforms are legal. One are legal type reforms. We need a legal reform in California that ends the California rule. When I worked at the Orange County Register, the Freedom Communications, I had a defined benefit pension, a very small one, but it was still a defined benefit. And one day we were told that starting tomorrow, that pension that is reduced. I think it was reduced to zero, but I can't remember. But they still had the other kind. But I was made good up through today. But starting tomorrow, that seemed fair. I mean, it's too bad, but you're not allowed to do that in California and some other states follow similar. You'll see similar debates over that. So the thing is to try to get it so that pension benefits can be reduced. Um, before cities get into bankruptcy. But there are all sorts of reforms that are needed at all sorts of levels. There in California, we've had local and state initiatives, attempts. The local initiatives have passed overwhelmingly. San Diego, San Jose, two cities with Democratic majorities. San Jose is overwhelmingly Democratic. Pension reform passed with 70% of the vote, and then the courts gutted the San Jose one because of that issue I had just mentioned, the California rule, the cutting benefits going forward. And that in California is what needs to be addressed because everything else is superficial. The state passed a lot of what passes as reform is so minor and only applies to new hires that you can't get rid of the problem only with the future people you're going to. We have a problem right now. Let's say I have a huge amount of debt right now. And all I'm going to do is trim future spending on things I haven't spent yet. I mean, is that going to fix the problem? Of course not.
Yeah.
But it's
that was exactly the sequestration that was big in the news a few years ago. It was the cut in future increases. Yet it was a huge travesty across all of politics.
right. And a lot of our fellow journalists went and accepted that that's a cut. Dramatic cuts in social services. Wait, it's not a cut. I mean, come on, let's use language properly. A cut is a reduction, not a reduction in your hope for rate of growth. Let's see, I budgeted to get a massive raise, and instead I only got a small raise. Oh my God, my salary's been dramatically cut. I don't think so. I think so. The reform issue, there is no one thing to look at reform. Local, you've got to look at local issues. You've got to look at state reforms. You have to be wise and realize that a lot of these reforms are phony reforms. The court related reforms, bankruptcy related reforms, because ultimately a lot of these cities are going to end up in bankruptcy if they don't fix their pensions and unfunded retiree health care. And health care is a worse situation than pensions, because pensions, there's at least some effort to fund some of it, where healthcare, but is typically not vested, which means you can cut those benefits. There's no money set aside to pay for those future, and it's in California and elsewhere that those amounts are going up. But the fundamental thing to remember is what is a city and what is a state? What are governments here for? Are they here? Like one official here in California said that cities have become pension providers that offer public services on the side. Now, is that, and I think that's a good way to look at it. Are these government agencies here to service the people who, who work for it? I would argue that's the way it is in reality. Sadly, I'm a big believer in public choice theory, where people think that if you delegate something to the government, that all of a sudden the public interest is going to be served. Well, in reality, the people who control government control it for their own benefit. I mean, that's a big surprise. But that's one way of coming at it. The other thing, looking at the cuts in services that are mandated, and look at other. There are all sorts of things to look at in like New York and Chicago. They have more retired police officers being paid for than actual police officers. And in San Diego, the city's payroll budget, somewhere around 70% goes to the retiree. I mean, if my newspaper had to pay 70% of its payroll budget for people who are retired to the beach, I don't think we'd be in business very long. And there are so many financial angles, and maybe we can do another one of these where we can get into some of the details, some specific story ideas. But there are so many. There are fairness issues, financial issues, legal issues, bankruptcy issues, union political power issues.
Keeping all those in mind, if we are, we really, in journalism, what we have to do is at least try to present a narrative, a skeptical narrative, figure out who the key people are. And the question that we try to ask whenever we're researching the pension crisis, obviously it's a very mundane subject, it's very complicated, there's a lot of math, there's a lot of different things to keep in mind. The question that I have is, who are the culprits? Where can we really dive down and explore this, and how can we make this sexy for the public, for the reading public, for every taxpayer to know, and not just a small set of policy analysts or people who dove into the pension debate a long time ago?
Well, I don't write about it like a think tanker. The name of my book is Plunder, and that gives you a clue of my thoughts on it. I focus a lot of my writing on abuses. People get outraged when they find out that Newport Beach, it's partly a salary story. Newport Beach lifeguards are often earning more than $200,000 a year and retiring with almost their full pension. And when you report on the size of the pensions, and there are a lot of databases out there giving you the information, you go through. There are all sorts of ridiculous pension spiking gimmicks. Like librarians in California get special pay that enhance their last year's pay for helping patrons find books. Fire chiefs get special management pay. If you fill in for your boss temporarily, he's on vacation, you get enhanced pension pay. These things, I find readers love them. So I don't agree with you that pensions are a boring or mundane issue. It's a fascinating issue, a gift that keeps on giving, because there's so many ways. Like for instance, one of my favorite stories that I did uh, on the pension issue was police and firefighter unions. And remember, I know this will surprise you that union officials will sometimes lie through their teeth. I know you're shocked, all falling over. Um, and police and firefighter officials will crazily use this public safety hero thing to way beyond the pale to lobby for more benefits Uh, so there's that. There's so many political stories, but the one that I did was they were saying always. In fact, I was on the Stossel show, and the union official said police and firefighters get these, six-figure pensions because they die 3 to 5 years after they retire because their jobs are so stressful and dangerous. So I went to the California Public Employee Retirement System, the union-run system that, believe me, is not a big fan of my writing, but they have, and I'm not a big fan of them, but they have great actuarial data and pretty nice people working there. And they provided me with a PowerPoint presentation debunking the myths of pensions and providing me with all the data and showing that the longest living public employee of any type is a police officer. They live in their mid 80s, followed closely behind by a firefighter. That it's complete, utter nonsense. And then I went and I tried to find the studies from the unions because then when I had the data, it was so much fun. Give me your study. Oh, yeah. Well, they send me not to a study, but to another article repeating the lie by some union official who cites another union official repeating the lie. It was hilariously fun, and it did have an impact. People saw it, and it got a lot. So there are a lot of really interesting stories. And the thing is, it's like if somebody just dumped a bunch of materials in your office, and there's so much in there, but you do have to spend time plowing through it because the data, the, when you start looking at things, you start looking at the pension spiking, the bogus injuries, that they like. There's something Sacramento Bee deemed chief's disease. Virtually every police chief in California retires with a disability. Some of them are hilarious, like one dropped a briefcase on his toe. Uh, Anywhere you look, any piece of data you choose, if you start paying attention to it, is fair game for great abuses and scams on the taxpayer. The key is understanding how the system works, or finding the people who can explain to you. And that's what I've done most of my career. I'm not a numbers guy. I understand some of it and enough of it, but I've often gone to good people who can explain it. And a lot of times those people don't agree with me on the basic overall policy, but as a reporter, you can talk to a lot of people and get good expert advice. And they can point to some really great data points that really lead. It's not the data that you're writing about; it's the story. And then you could put. There's so many faces of abuse, right? You can find these um, scammers, these who are retired on disabilities, and now, I mean, I know reporters have done it. They're retired on disabilities, and they're found, weightlifting at the gym, and these are great stories. The public loves them. Yeah, I have found no lack of public interest in these stories.
Okay. No, and to your point, you've written a book on that, and you have made it very interesting, and it certainly has provided a lot of inspiration, at least from the reporting that I've seen, just getting into it, diving in. I know there have been a lot of stories in New Jersey, a few retired sheriffs who go on, who apparently were on disability but are now on reality TV shows, and all kind of things like that, and it's pretty crazy.
Yeah,
And
Mark in New Jersey's done great stories catching some of these guys, and there's lots and lots of good reporting on it. Lots of people from Watchdog, a lot of newspapers, even newspapers that are, think of have more of a liberal editorial bent, have been like the Sacramento Bee, LA Times have done great stuff on this, and then it leads to a lot of other stories like the bureaucratization of public service. I did the piece for an op-ed in the LA Times about in Alameda after the firefighters stood around while a man drowned to death and didn't do anything because of their bureaucratic rules wouldn't allow them to intervene. So it's not a pension story, but there are a lot of public service stories and bureaucracy stories that once you start looking at the pension system, look, you realize it's just basically these are basically Soviet-esque bureaucracies or Rube Goldberg-esque bureaucracies or something out of these crazy novels, that dystopian novels, and there's it angers me. That's why I plow into it. It angers me, so it's really fun to write about.
yeah, and you've done a great job with that, and I will put the link to your book. It is Plunder, how public employee unions are raiding treasuries, controlling our lives, and bankrupting the nation. I'll put that in the description, and anyone is free to go and click and buy it. It's a simple and well, I guess it would be very informative as well for your reporting. So I have to thank you again, Stephen, for taking the time to talk to me about this very important issue, and I hope that people are now a little bit more enlightened about what this pension crisis is all about. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.